And we are very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Kevin Sabet from the University of Florida. He's also worked in the White House under 3 different presidents, and he, along with Patrick Kennedy, co-founded Project SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana. He's an internationally known speaker, and he consults with the United Nations, and we're very, very happy to have him here. Mr. Sabet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson, Sue, and such a privilege to share an agenda with such incredible people, many of my mentors and heroes and folks who've been on this path with us for the last couple of years. Really, as you all know, this path that we're seeing of increasing acceptance of marijuana. And none of us were alive 100 and some years ago when this country went down the most destructive path we've ever gone down in public health, and that was the legitimization of tobacco. We can't be blamed for that, right? We weren't there. Probably most of us weren't around, I don't know, maybe John Redmond was around 4,000 years ago, when we normalized the most deadly intoxicant from a public health sort of macro point of view, alcohol. And we sure weren't around when the legitimization of alcohol started about 100 and some years ago, well before Prohibition. But we are around now, during a pivotal time in our history, where we are about to make a decision as a country whether or not we're going to go down the path of the mass normalization and commercialization of a third drug. And then, of course, that drug is marijuana. Now, I know that what state I'm in, this is my home state, actually, and I never get back here, so it was such a pleasure to be invited. I went to school up not too far northeast, I guess, in Berkeley. And I get that this issue is sometimes hard, and I know many of you are in law enforcement prevention and treatment. You're dealing with it in an environment where you hear every day that this is not addictive, in an environment where I know that the kids that you work with tell you, like they tell me, Kevin, marijuana is not addictive. I know so because I use it every day. That's what someone told me a couple weeks ago. And Marilyn will love this one. The other kid who told me, Kevin, I'm a much better driver stoned than anything else. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, because I go 30 in a 65 mile per hour zone, which is much better. And we laugh, and I think if we weren't laughing, we'd be crying, really. Because and I know all of you, as I'm even seeing your body language now, you're dealing with this on a daily basis. And I know this is hard in this state. I was part of a group, I started a group the second day I was in school called the Citizens for a Drug-Free Berkeley. I know, you can laugh. And it was, as you're thinking, and I won't take offense, it was about as popular as the Coalition for a Wine-Free France. That is true. But the point is, it doesn't matter what state we're in or what we're doing. It matters to stick to the science and the evidence and the data. And make no mistake about it, folks, we are living in an era where we're about to legitimize the next big tobacco. And no matter what happens in November, no matter what happens next year, no matter what happens with the next presidential administration or the next Congress, in 100 years, this very similar group is going to be probably in this exact same convention center. And they're going to be saying, what were they thinking? Right? Because that's what we're saying about things like, Joe Camel. What were they thinking? Things like candy cigarettes. What were they thinking? Things like not instituting a ban on advertising for liquor, so that's why we have the alcohol ads that we have. What were they thinking? And it's very easy for people to brush you aside as reefer madness, and you're just wanting to lock people up. But we have to be effective in the way we talk about this. And so when I was recently in the last administration, and it's so nice to be able to be in, this is really his turf, David Mineta, in the presence of David Mineta, because with his leadership at ONDCP, he's such a tireless advocate for this community, and especially for prevention, treatment, and recovery, and people like Dr. Madras, who we'll see tomorrow, their service at ONDCP. When I was there this last time, it was very clear that we were setting up this, what I would call this false dichotomy. And I'm going to just show the little image here if it works. There we go. The false dichotomy between basically normalization or incarceration. And so we're being presented a choice. And this is when you talk about this issue with your neighbors, probably a lot of well-meaning people, and there are a lot, say, maybe we just need to legitimize it because of the war on drugs has been a disaster. And they're thinking about it in the way that really, I would say, the pot lobby has presented it, which is this false dichotomy that the only two ways to deal with this are either incarceration or legalization. Right? Those are your choices. And it's like the political appointees would tell us at the White House, if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, you can't talk about it. And that's how policy, and it's not Democrat or Republican, folks, it's both. So you can't blame one party or the other. And so we often reduce policy to the bumper sticker because that's maybe what people can understand and grasp, and we want to keep it to simple concepts. But this is not a simple issue. It's a complex issue, as we heard from Dr. Eustace, all the different considerations we need to have. So that's why we wanted to start this group, SAM. I just talked a little bit about smart approaches to marijuana. Let's see if we can get the clicker. There we go. Which is a 501c3, and we wanted to make it bipartisan. So Patrick Kennedy was in recovery. Congressman Kennedy was one of the few people who said a remarkable thing. You're going to be stunned that it took Congress only 100 years to realize this very complex thing. It's just stunning. And that thing is that the brain is an actual part of the body. Now, you might be thinking what I mean by that. Folks, we never treat the brain like the body. If you need a new hip or a new knee or a sprained ankle or a tennis elbow, we'll take care of you. We're not going to push you into the church basement and tell you to shut up about it and be quiet and move on and get over it. We're going to treat you, we're going to probably cover it if you have coverage, and we're going to move on. But if something's going on up here, we somehow take a very different view. As if it's, even though that's the most important organ that we have. You can live without an arm or a leg. I don't think you should, but you can't. It's hard to live without a brain, and it's hard to have a functioning life without a brain that is as functioning as it can be. So when people say that pot isn't a deadly drug, Kevin, only heroin is, pot doesn't kill you. It's not the deadly drug. It's not a fatal drug. Focus on the opiates. Focus on the things that kill you. That might be true, although we'll talk about drugs, driving, and other things that can happen. But even that aside, it may not be the deadly drug, but I call it the dropout drug. Because you don't just drop out of school, which you could, but you drop out of life. Think about the people who are using pot every day. And so we wanted to start SAM to have an enlightened discourse on this topic, to remind people of the horrors of big tobacco, because we have very short memories. The best drug historian in our lifetime is a mentor of mine who passed away about a decade ago, named David Musto. And David Musto talked about generational forgetting. We have these drug epidemics. Think about ecstasy in 1998. I was here. We remember, right, the designer drugs in the late 90s. And then there was a drop-off because there was a lot of information about it, so there was a reduction in use. Prevention actually did work, and people who say, well, it never worked, it did work, and it actually worked there. But now, 15 years ago, we see an uptick in some of those drugs. We have this generational forgetting. We tend to forget. We've had a heroin epidemic before, folks. This isn't new. Yes, the issue with OxyContin and the opiates, and we can thank, by the way, another industry for that, right? Purdue Pharma, who essentially targeted poor white communities in Virginia and the coal mining communities in the 90s, and said, boy, do we have a magic pill for you. We promise it's not addictive and it's harmless. That's how the opiate epidemic started. And that was another industry that did the exact same thing. They went, by the way, they go to the poorest communities. Now maybe things have changed around San Jose, but where are the liquor stores here? Are they in the rich upper class communities where the best schools are in? Of course they're not. The industry targets the most vulnerable among us. So that's what they did with Purdue Pharma and with OxyContin. And that is what they're doing right now with marijuana. And you talk to someone like Jim Gerhardt, who has incredible experience in Colorado, or others, and you will talk, and they will say that. So we tend to forget how these problems work. So we wanted to have a new organization to talk about this in a different way. Because look, we don't want to throw people in prison. And that, unfortunately, we've been mislabeled like that. We want to throw, if you're against marijuana, it means you want everyone to go to prison and you love the criminal justice system just as it is. Well, we may have diverse views on that, but that's not necessarily true. And so we wanted to find the most liberal person we could find and the most conservative person we could find together. So Patrick Kennedy, the son of late Senator Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion of the Senate, in a heartbeat said, Kevin, I'm going to get a lot of flack from some of my colleagues on the left, but I have to tell you, I've never seen an industry like this since tobacco. We have to work against this. And we have to offer people something, hope, not just against. We need to offer solutions. So I want to be part of this, but we have to find we want to find someone on the right as well. So we wanted to find a Republican. Now, Dick Cheney wouldn't return any of my phone calls, because that would have been a neat combo. Kennedy and Cheney. That didn't work. But, actually, by the way, if jokes aside, Patrick is now working with Newt Gingrich on the BRAIN Initiative, which just came out on opiates and medication-assisted treatment, which is amazing. But anyway, at the time, thank you. At the time, I don't think Newt was around. He was a little busy, also running for president. So we got David Frum, who wrote the speeches for George Bush during the Iraq War. So he invented the term axis of evil. So you have axis of evil up with the liberal line of the Senate, and I think that's a good bipartisan mixture. And then we got the scientists from around the country, because the scientists said, well, yeah, we'll be part of this, Kevin, and this is, I think, very interesting. They said, Kevin, we've already done stuff on this before. Like, we're already working on, like, doesn't every American, like, read the 300-page report that we wrote on the harms of I mean, don't people just know what NIDA is and that website, and they just look at the stuff? Doesn't everyone know what that is, and they look at it? And it was sort of a rude awakening to tell them, well, not really, they don't. Actually, the average 16-year-old does not read the Journal of the American Medical Association before they go to bed at night. And if they want to learn about marijuana, I wish they would read Lancet Psychiatry. As they did last week, they would see a 3-time increase in schizophrenia among long-term marijuana users, but they don't do that. They Google, is marijuana addictive? Right? They Google medical marijuana. They Google, what are the medical effects of marijuana? And they get from that, essentially, what you would have gotten 50 years ago if you went to a library, or 60 years ago, and looked up the harms of tobacco. 60 years ago, if you went to a library to read about tobacco, you would be reading from the Tobacco Institute's publication. You all know what the Tobacco Institute was. It was the lobbying firm for the tobacco industry when they hired scientists to work for them and say that tobacco was not only not addictive, not harmful, but it was actually good for you. It was medical. The medical argument's been used far before Prop 215 was passed, let me tell you. Okay? So, but this time, the modern version of that is to basically manipulate a Google search, which is very easy to do if you have a little bit of money, and when you have hundreds of millions of dollars, which they do, it's very, very easy to do. And that is how information is getting out there. So we wanted to try and change that. And you can go to our website, which is learnaboutsam.org, and get some of that information if you want. But we wanted to push against this false dichotomy because we really think that this is about the Marlborization of marijuana. This is about the reincarnation of Joe Camel. Because folks, we can talk about the harms of marijuana all day, and we should. And tomorrow you're going to hear one of the world's experts talk about it, Dr. Magic, so I'm going to skip over even some of my slides on that because you're going to hear from someone more knowledgeable than me on that issue. But it's not just important to talk about the science, it's important to talk about the economics, and the economics of an addictive industry. Now, these are our friends at the alcohol industry. Our friends at the alcohol industry know that most people do not need to be alcoholics for them to make money. In fact, 85% or so of Americans drink responsibly. They're not part of the 100,000 deaths a year. They're not part of the DUI issue on the roads. They're not part of the employer issue when coming to work drunk. They're not part of the violence and alcohol issue. They are people who drink a few glasses of wine a week, some beers on the weekends, and they don't have any problems, if any, with alcohol. But they don't need everyone to have problems. They need about 10% of people to have a problem. And if they can push that up to 15 or 20, they'll do even better. In order to make money. In other words, they only make money off of the people who use a lot of their substance. And that is the simple economics 101 of an addictive industry. You don't need everyone to be addicted, but you need a good minority of folks, and you need them to use a lot of your product. And to do that, you need to downplay the harms, you need to lobby relentlessly so to make your product as cheap as possible, because we're all sensitive, even crack addicts are sensitive to price. That's why law enforcement is so important, to drive up price and reduce availability, and we forget about why that's important. So you need to actually drive up the price. Now, are there other problems with increased prices? Yes, but when you come from a demand point of view, you want the price to go up. When you come from the point of view of an industry, though, you don't want the price to go up. You want the prices to be cheap. Prices right now in Colorado and Washington are falling dramatically. And that's exactly what folks, economists predicted would happen. But with the alcohol industry, they say things like, enjoy responsibly, on the bottom of their ads. Folks, if everybody enjoyed responsibly, there would be no alcohol industry. They certainly wouldn't be able to afford Super Bowl advertising, let alone other advertising. And so it's really a lie. They don't want everyone to enjoy it. They should say, 8 out of 10 of you, please enjoy responsibly. 2 out of 10, we need you to be an alcoholic. And we do. That's the only way they make money. And so, why would another industry that pushes a drug that, I don't care if it's more, the argument is it more or less harmful than alcohol is as stupid as, it's like saying, is jumping off of the 4th floor building worse or better than jumping off of the 5th floor? They're both bad ideas. And it's really dumb to pit one against the other, but the lobby does that all the time. But the point is, why would a marijuana industry be any different? This is an industry, alcohol, that is enjoying the lowest taxes that they have ever enjoyed. 80%, alcohol is 80% less in terms of its tax rate than it was during the Korean War. And when I say that to high school students, I sometimes talk to young people, they have to look up what the Korean War was. They don't even know. They're like Wikipediaing exactly the years because they don't really know. They're not really taught it in school. It was that long ago is when and it was 80% now. And I'm not going to blame one party or the other, folks. That's a revolving door of our politics in terms of special interest groups. That's just the name of the game. When you're a member of Congress and you have maybe a dozen staff work on issues, folks, you vote on 1,000 different issues a year. Of course you need lobbyists. You need lobbyists, because otherwise you couldn't be educated on everything. But the problem is they obviously come with their point of view. And the alcohol industry, you might think that those rich social workers and teachers and, the rich treatment, counselors would have a lobby in Washington, and they do to some extent, but let me tell you, they're nothing compared to the 3-piece suits of the alcohol, pharma, and tobacco, and now marijuana industry. And I just don't know why, when we have these examples, why it would be any different if we further legitimized it. So I agree with the news we covered last year of big tobacco is back. Now they're talking about vaping, which is a different frontier, which we haven't really talked about as much, which we should, because young people are vaping so much more. But folks, this is an industry, the marijuana industry, that is riding the coattails of tobacco, and they are often commingled. It's not one or the other. They're often working in concert because, if you're in the business of growing a plant that is addictive to a lot of people and processing it and rolling it and marketing it, whether the plant is tobacco or marijuana, there are capital costs that you can absorb and do both. And that's exactly what's beginning to happen. Right now, the tide of money across the country has really pushed this idea of legalization all over the country. And we're not getting into details about that today because we're really just talking about education. But it is important to understand that money often equals power and political influence. And so you wonder why why are the states that incarcerate and criminalize marijuana the least the ones that are the most targeted right now? Well, you go after the low-hanging fruit. This is a political battle for these folks, political and economic battle. And there have been consequences. In this country, we don't like to talk about it, but there's been an average increase in marijuana use every year by 5 to 6% if you listen to the household survey data. Now, we hear from the spinsters that, well, if you looked at another year, it's higher or lower. When you look at the time span of the last 8 years, which is really when the push for normalization has continued, we see an increase that I think is very troubling. And the increase that I think is most troubling, and this is a graph I borrowed from John Calkins, is the fact that our daily users of marijuana, the bottom actually, the green and yellow, has increased by about 800% in the last 15 or 20 years. That's daily use. The top is binge drinking. So don't listen to the hype that drinking goes down if marijuana goes up. The marijuana and alcohol are largely complements, not substitutes, even though they want to say, let's provide a safer choice. That's another false dichotomy. That's a political slogan. It's not a choice. For most people who use marijuana regularly, they also drink. And so the issue is there's been an increase in both and a big increase in daily use. And I think that's problematic. Look, if you're a baby, if you're my parents' age and you're smoking marijuana on a Friday night and falling asleep and you're retired and you wake up on Saturday and you do what you're doing, I'm not saying that's a good thing necessarily, but that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about this. I'm not talking about that. And let me tell you, the industry could care less about that person, because that is not who they're aiming for. You know, you don't get, brand loyalty does not start at age 50. You know, when the baby boomers are like, ooh, we haven't used marijuana since the 70s and the kids have moved out, so I'm going to use it now, you know, once a month, and that's why I want legalization. Well, that's just dumb. That's not what they're focused on. The lobby needs young users. There's a reason why you had, apple-flavored cigarettes for so long. There's a reason why we have pot gummy bears. Let's just get that out in the open, right? The pot gummy bear isn't aimed at the, 50-year-old, 60-year-old. That doesn't mean that 50 to 60-year-olds, 40-year-olds can't enjoy gummy bears, don't get me wrong. But when you make a great flavored gummy bear and candy and ice cream and soda, and you call it what you do, and you have these crazy labels, and you have these fluorescent colors, you're obviously aiming towards young people, because you need that developing brain that Dr. Madras will talk more about tomorrow, that Marilyn talked about earlier. You need that developing brain in order to get that loyalty. That's what this whole thing is about. And you need that brain to really enjoy what they're doing and to want to do it every day, or every week, multiple times. And because that is how you make money. Just like in the alcohol industry, you make money among the alcoholics, not the occasional drinker. So there are many myths about marijuana. This actually comes from my book, which is going to be updated in a few months, but it came out in 2013, called Reefer Sanity: 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. I'm not going to have time to go through all of these myths. I also want to take questions. But there are so many myths out there about this that I do want to cover a few. And obviously, we talked a little bit already about the developing brain. Marilyn said it right. People talk about 20, 25. We're really talking about age 30. And if we had a science-based alcohol policy, I get that the reality may be different, folks. But if it was purely science-based, we wouldn't be talking about 21 as an age. That's not when the brain is developed. And so your brain is going under so many incredible changes. And again, I'm not going to dwell on it. But when you start increasing the THC, which is really what this is about, this is not the Woodstock weed of the 60s. This is not your daddy's weed. This is marijuana that's been, with common breeding techniques that agriculture, modern farming uses, has been sort of bred to increase the THC part of marijuana. Marijuana is such an incredibly complex plant. Hundreds of components, at least 100 that work directly on the brain that we call cannabinoids. And the one that binds to the receptors that give us that feeling is THC. And that's really the important one if you want to get high. It's THC. Now, THC also has some, because it gets you high, it follows, similar to opiates, it also may have some pain analgesic issues, although it doesn't mean it would be superior to opiates by any means. But the point is, if you want to get the greater high, you need to get marijuana that has higher amounts of THC. And so the average has just been pushed up and up. And of course, in a state like California, this is a joke, because 12% THC was, what was going on in the 80s probably here, not now. So California obviously is skewed towards the side of much higher levels of average THC. And we see that affecting the brain in profound ways, which I'm not going to linger on right now. You certainly didn't have, I do want to talk about this real quick. You certainly did not have these kinds of waxes that I'm sure others are going to talk about that are close to 99% pure. These sort of oils that become waxes of THC. We certainly didn't have that 15 years ago. And now we're seeing these being used and vaporized, which we have no idea what the effects are, folks. The data that we're going to hear about tomorrow, that you heard about earlier from Dr. Hustis and others, folks, this is data. We're using THC that's out there that's maybe 5 to 10 to 15%. We're not studying what the 98% does on the brain. But just imagine. And do you think that these laws that are being proposed anywhere to normalize policies, whether medical or otherwise, accounts for this? No. This is defined like marijuana, just like the ditchweed that you might have found in the 50s on the freeway that had a little bit of THC. Those things are defined the same. And this is also part of the obscuring campaign by an industry that needs to make money and needs people to be addicted to thrive. Right? Otherwise, you would write a law that would say, all right, if you're 30 or over and you have 6% THC that you grew at home, we're not going to criminalize you. Why aren't the laws written like that, the proposed ones? Why are they written to essentially allow this to be advertised on a billboard on a freeway? That's how they're written. And I don't think that the average Californian or the average American understands that. That the devil is in the details here. This is not about adult. I don't care if you're an adult using occasionally. This is not about that. Now, I don't want you to be an adult and use and drive a car, or be my doctor, or fly the plane. I travel a lot. There are some caveats to that. I'm not saying it's harmless. But that is not the point of the industry. The point of the industry is to start them young. And unfortunately, starting them young means a host of negative impacts, which you're going to hear more about, regarding IQ, regarding education. Folks, we rank near dead last in education in the world among the industrialized countries. And we spend, by the way, one of the highest number per pupil because of the inefficiencies in our educational system. And, because we pay teachers so much money, right? Is that a part of it? It has nothing to do with it, obviously. We have one of the lowest pays for teachers, yet we spend one of the highest number of it on education. Imagine that inefficiency. It's not like that's going to teachers. We don't know where that's going, actually. And yet our outcomes are horrendous for that kind of spending. And then on top of that, we want to say we're going to add marijuana to the mix. A drug that, this is a demotivating drug. When I played sports in high school, I was hoping and wishing that, I guess I shouldn't have done this, but from a selfish point of view, I wanted the opposing team to be high on marijuana. It wasn't an enhancing drug. It wasn't a motivating drug. When I was applying to Ivy League, I wanted the kids that said, I'm a straight A student, as you all know, and I smoke weed every day and I'm fine. I wanted them to keep smoking marijuana because it was going to help me get ahead. So this isn't an enhancing drug by any means. This detracts. And if you care about education, how in the world can you say, I'm okay with pot gummy bears advertised on the freeway? I'm okay with the coupons that we see in Colorado and Washington and the billboards that we see offering free samples. Folks, it's like the Costco of marijuana when you go to some of these states. Free samples, and if you have a membership card, you get a discount. That's really what it is. How could we want that? I have to stray from the script because there was a recent meeting at the UN, and it was all the countries meeting, and I wasn't representing the U.S. government anymore. I was as an NGO, which was a nice feeling. And because you can, sort of say and do what you want, so that was good. And, I can't tell you how embarrassing it was, though, in the circles of conversations with countries like South Korea and Japan and China. China, 4 regions in China rank in the top 10 of educational outcomes. 4 different regions. And the United States as a whole is like number 40. Okay, so you had China, South Korea, Singapore, which recently tripled teacher education, and Japan, and they were saying to me, Kevin, wait a minute, we're having debates about how to pay teachers more. Should we extend the school day by 60% or 70%? We're embarrassed by the fact that 2% of our high school students will drop out. 2%. That was Singapore. That's very embarrassing. And tell me the debate you're having again in your country. Marijuana. What are the priorities? And I have to sort of say, well, I don't represent the government, and sort of walk away from it, and, enough about me, tell me more about you, kind of thing. It's embarrassing. It was very embarrassing. But, this is what we're dealing with. And let me tell you, we're talking about trade in the political discourse these days, and no matter what side you're on, we're talking about competitiveness, we're talking about the workforce, we're talking about educational outcomes. We cannot divorce this conversation. This may not be a top-tier political thing that everyone's talking about, but we cannot forget about this conversation when we talk about those other things, because there are absolutely ripple effects that we may not see for 20 or 30 years. By the time that comes, it's too late. And then there's the mental health issue, which we should absolutely not forget. Marijuana, more than any other drug that we know about, more than heroin, folks, I hate to break it to you, more than alcohol, more than the opiates, it has these links to long-term schizophrenia, which, anybody who's lived with anyone who's a schizophrenic, good luck. The reversal rate on that is not impossible, because we don't want to sort of say there's no hope for people. But, if you wanted to pick the worst brain disease, that would be, I'd like to hear other people's opinions, that would be my pick, by far, would be schizophrenia. And then you look at the short-term psychotic outcomes, which some people would say, well, you just need to calm down and drink some water and you're fine. Well, not if you're, Levi Thumba, who was the 19-year-old who had a psychotic break when he had half of a candy bar and then jumped off of the building in Colorado. His cousin who's reached out to us said, Kevin, this was a candy bar, and this was legal because it was chocolate. And the company who produced this chocolate said that my cousin should have only eaten 1 square out of 20, because that's the serving size. Now, you can't laugh about the tragedy, but with all due respect, does anybody have 1 square of chocolate when they eat a candy bar? How is that even realistic? But that is the excuses that we get, and which is the same thing that tobacco would say for years about, what you should use and what would be recommended or not. These are the excuses that we're hearing. And they result in tragedies. And so the mental health issue, when you look at today's high-potent marijuana, and I think Bertha will talk more about that tomorrow, is incredible in terms of the link with different kinds of mental illness. And people say, well, did the mental illness cause them to self-medicate, which is a term that pop culture has made up. Self-medicate, not that it's not valid, but it's just, it's a very difficult term to define. Self-medicate with marijuana, or was it the marijuana that caused it? It's chicken before the egg. You know what, to me it doesn't matter. The fact that it exacerbates the issue, I don't care what came first, it exacerbates the issue, and we're not understanding that. So you have mental health advocates, people who say they are the #1 advocate for mental health care, and the shame on the government, rightfully so, for ignoring this issue for a century. Ignoring, though, this link, which is so important to understand. Not so much the occasional users, but the regular users, especially those before 15 and 16 who start. The chances for long-term schizophrenia, that's a 4-fold to 6-fold increase, depending on the study you're looking at. Long-term studies that have been done. That is scary. And we don't want to use scare tactics, and we're going to be accused of that all the time, but that is scary, if there's a risk. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. I have kids and others who say, Kevin, I use and I'm fine, or you're fine. Plenty of people will use and be fine. Folks, no one is saying that that's not the case. Just like plenty of people who drink and drive tonight, do you know that 95% of drunk drivers will not get into a car crash tonight? Most people who smoke regularly will not get lung cancer. If you go home today and don't wear a seatbelt, you have less than a 1% chance of getting into a fatal car crash. That's not, the probability isn't the issue. But there are all those things that we discourage. We don't encourage it. We don't say, you know what, don't wear your seatbelt because there's a 90% chance you're going to be fine. Don't worry about smoking because most smokers won't get lung cancer. And that's true. We would never say that. And yet the lobby is trying, and it is a lobby, folks, don't make no mistake about it, is trying to manipulate us to think like, well, in most cases we know people and they're fine, and we all know people, ourselves included, who tried it and used it and we're fine. And that's okay, but they totally ignore the flip side of this, which is that the risk goes up. So if you're a smoker, you may not get lung cancer, but your risk of it versus me, who doesn't smoke, is 70 times greater. So you can take the risk or not, but you have 70 times more likely to get lung cancer than me, who has never smoked. You may not get it, but it's still an increased risk. And that is sometimes hard for, I think, people to grasp, because they just see. The other thing that's hard for people to grasp is that they think that today's drug dealer is, some scary foreign immigrant who's bringing the drugs and everything else. Folks, the reality is that I gotta say those guys have nothing on what I would call the modern drug dealers. And the modern drug dealers are my old friends from Oxford, literally. My old friends from Berkeley. My teammates from high school. They're the people that you would invite to your home for Thanksgiving. They're not a scary entity that is like sort of another group. They're people dressed very well, who frankly avoid marijuana, they say, because they have to actually go to a meeting in the morning, and so they wouldn't want to be using marijuana, which is, by the way, with the tobacco. The tobacco execs never smoked. Did you know that? When we found the tobacco documents, most of them never smoked. And they said, this is what they said. They said, we don't touch that expletive. They said, we reserve that right, and they were joking about it, we reserve that right for the young, the poor, the black, and the stupid. And that's what they said in the 50s, and it's documented. It's the same thing. So these are the guys that are the very well spoken. If they ever had a hemp T-shirt, it's been exchanged for a nice button down. If they ever had long hair, they've cut it since. And they are here to make money, and they really don't care how they make the money. This is just could be any other substance. It just happens to be the one that we've been pushing normalization for so long, so it's the convenient one. So this M that's important to them is not marijuana, it is money. And the green is not marijuana, it is money. And cash. And that's what this is about. And I'm just picking a couple of them, but there are many more. And they're very sophisticated. It's scary, actually, to think about it, really, because they're not like the guy, they're not Cheech and Chong. When I say that, by the way, no high schooler knows what I'm talking about. They might know Tommy Chong if they watch Dancing with the Stars, but the Cheech and no, that, again, and it's funny, but it also is a wake-up call, because we're dealing with a new era, folks, a new era of marijuana and a new era of drug dealing. It's not from the past. When I was introduced the other day in another talk, the person said, Kevin is going to talk about that roach clip that gets passed around at your parties. They were saying that to a group of 15-year-olds. One of them raised their hand. They thought they were in the wrong assembly, that I was going to be talking about environmental insect extermination techniques with a roach clip. They had no idea that had anything to do with drugs, marijuana. That's not a term that's used. And then the kid in the back said, is he going to talk about dabbing? And some of us know what dabbing is. It's that wax I showed earlier. And the poor vice principal had no idea what the kid was talking about. And they said, Dad. This also shows what I'm talking about with the generational, I think, discord. And the baby boomers today who say, we all used it in the 60s and we're fine, and shame on the war on drugs. But they also forget very easily our past with tobacco. And I do like to bring it up. I do like to show you the ads again, because we haven't seen them in a while. The ads that say, doctors smoke, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. The ads from the late 1800s that tout asthma cigarettes for your health. Medical tobacco. If you thought Prop 215 was the first time anybody slapped the word medical on something and that was supposed to make it okay, it wasn't. Now, of course, it's very different, because there are, and we do know that the science has shown there are components and also extracts and ways to actually get some medicinal benefit of marijuana. Don't get me wrong, there is medicinal benefit in the marijuana plant. But the matter, in my opinion, should be left to science, not the average voter. When's the last time you voted on the latest cancer medication? Anybody? Would you even want to vote on the latest cancer medication? But for some reason, we've just put all that aside and said we need to vote on this because I know somebody who has some illness that said that it was benefiting them. And I'm not doubting that people benefit from it either. I'm not saying that every person with a, sort of a lot of these rare kind of brain or other kind of muscular diseases is lying. I'm not calling them liars. But the process by which we've done this has turned into a joke. And anybody in California, anywhere you go, can admit that. And on any side of this, you fake a headache and you have your card and you're done. We should treat this like a real medicine. I know it's shocking and extreme to say that medicine should be dispensed by pharmacists and, prescribed by doctors. Crazy, right? But I think that's how we should treat it. Now, it doesn't mean we've done the best job for research. We haven't. We need to do a better job. And I'm glad that the DEA took the step that they did to increase the research quota and the places that marijuana can be grown for research purposes. We should do that. But that should be separated from this conversation, folks. That is not about the, more doctors use tobacco and pot gummy bears. That is a separate discussion. And we get lost in that discussion. And so this, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but this industry has become increasingly sophisticated. This is, and I got to tell you, here we are in Santa Clara. This is a Silicon Valley Wall Street partnership. And so here we are talking about it, which is amazing. Normally I'm bad-mouthing Silicon Valley and other places. I'm not actually here, so no. But in reality, it is a partnership because it's about money and it's about innovation. And it's about not going to daddy to get a check written for $1,000 to start a little pot shop on the corner. It's about going to the institutional, the angel investors, the names that you would recognize who own major multinational corporations. You can look them up yourselves. They're linked to massive hotel chains, which I will remain nameless right now. They're linked to massive online, the most successful online business that isn't Amazon, which you can decide what that is on your own. They're linked to all of this. And so they're now going much more, we did an analysis, much more from the venture side and the angel investors than they are the kind of old, daddy write me a little check. It's sophisticated now. And it's not a bunch of potheads. It's not the baby boomers, actually, as much. It's the guys that are closer to my age, actually. And I do say guys, mainly guys, and it's mainly guys that look like me. It's mainly white guys, by the way. It's not like, they said, oh, we're going to have social justice, and so we're going to spread the wealth. That hasn't exactly happened. And, we've heard those promises before. I think marginalized communities have heard those promises before. We'll share in the riches. Come along with us. Yeah, well, you should do your own research about who these people are and what their backgrounds are. So it's major firms. They're located in both in Canada and in the U.S. They're partnering. They're buying the name Bob Marley. They literally bought the name Bob Marley. Like they literally bought that name. So if you want to use that anywhere, you can't, because they have the royalties that they bought for $50 million from the widow of Bob Marley, the name, so that they could market when marijuana in their mind is legal. They can market Marley Naturals because it's natural, after all, right? It's a plant. Because that's what another kid said to me the other day. Kevin, he said, are you anti-God? That was the question. because it's a plant, and it's from God. So how dare you? And I said, well, I'm not anti-God, if you happen to ask. I'll gladly reveal that. But I also don't think you should be smoking poison ivy anytime soon. And that also comes from God. They use the same logic. But they use that, it's twisted logic, it's a plant. Folks, the plant doesn't resemble the plant from thousands of years ago. We talk about cannabis having been used, it was used in some populations, pharaohs, China, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000 years ago. We have evidence of that. But it is nothing to do with the quote-unquote plant that is being used to process the flowering buds of THC on the marijuana plant to be mainly vaporized or smoked or eaten or whatnot. It's a totally different issue. But they love to use the word natural and organic, and all the other kinds of things, when in reality they're not usually any of those things. So you should decide whether, next time somebody asks you, if you can tell the difference between, in this picture, we have marijuana products, we have tobacco products, and we have non-drug products. And so if this was really about an industry that wanted to be responsible, that didn't want to market to kids, that didn't want to have these, I don't think they would be having these kinds of items. And the picture says 1,000 words. This is what you need to show your colleague or neighbor, your smart, enlightened colleague, neighbor, child, parent, grandparent, who says this isn't a really big deal. This is what the new frontier is about. And so when you read about what the regulators in Colorado are saying, because they have to say certain things, so their paycheck is now being paid in some respects by the industry because it's legal. But when you hear even them talk about this, and you press them on edibles, they say, yeah, we didn't really expect that. Whoops. We didn't expect the market to be so big in that, and it's actually at least 50% of the market. Yeah, we didn't expect that they would put the billboards up, because we had a rule about it. We just thought people would follow the rules. We didn't expect the under 21s to use it, because we have an age, and we put 21 as the law, and that's been such a success with alcohol. So we thought that people would just abide by it. We took care of that, they say. Because when you bring up the kids issue, they'll say to you now in California or other states, they'll say, no, we took care of that. We wrote 21. We wrote adults use. We wrote, this and that. Big deal. When you have an out-of-control industry that I call a corporate cannabis free-for-all, which is exactly what it is, that is targeting your elected officials, which they've done very effectively here in my home state. And when you have that happening and you have the money behind it, good luck with your rule, good luck with your advertising, bans, good luck with your product reliability. Good luck with all of that. And then the myth that we hear that this is about money. We can make so much money, right? Okay, well, gosh, alcohol and tobacco are taxed here in California. California has some of the highest taxes on, and I live in New York City now, so there's a rivalry, I think, between the tobacco taxes there and here, but pretty high taxes, which is good, actually. You'd argue that is good. So do you have tobacco, how's the tobacco treatment on demand going? I'm going to put David on the spot here and ask that. But really, how is tobacco treatment on demand going? Everyone who needs tobacco cessation and treatment gets it? But it's legal. It's taxed the highest in the country. What about alcohol? On demand treatment, available to anybody who wants it, high quality, not this 30-day junk fill in the bubble by the insurance company, but actually real treatment. Yeah, okay, well, you've now had the guy, lived here from 1981 to 1990 to 2000. We've had a California lottery, I remember that discussion. Yeah. So, education, number one in the country, how's that go? I can't even say that with a straight face. Pretend that I'm asking my own state about education. issue. But this was what was supposed to be resolved. So now we think that by some magic, that this marijuana is the answer to our prayers for all of this. And again, you talk to the different states. By the way, this is, you talk to the different states like Colorado and others, this, even the New York Times has said this won't save state budgets. In fact, I just very hastily pasted a Denver Post, I don't think it's up there. There was a Denver Post piece that also said the same thing. Oh, here it is. Just why, this is by the independent nonprofit think tank in Colorado that does the tax analysis. They said why pot taxes can't solve Colorado's budget problems. And this is the #1 promise that we're promised by the ganjapreneurs, I guess we can call them. And the people who are dangling this right in front of our face and saying, you could have a piece of this too. Don't give it to the drug dealers, because the drug dealers are, they're going to go away. Right? That's what we're told. They're going to just go right away. And when you look at alcohol and tobacco taxes, obviously, the question I asked was facetious, because for every $1 you get an alcohol and tobacco tax, you spend 10 in social costs. Thank you very much. They're not legal because they're this public health wonder. No cop has ever said, if there were only more drunk people, we would have a much better job, a much easier job. No one's ever said that. They're legal for cultural reasons. And people say, well, why is one legal, not the other? Folks, culture. Alcohol, been in our culture for 5,000 years, widespread, accepted use by 70% of the population. We're stuck with it. And most of us use it responsibly, thankfully. But the small number of people who don't actually cost us a ton of money. And we live with it. And prohibition, quote unquote, failed, although we can have a debate on that another day. But if you even accept that premise, let's just accept it for a minute and say prohibition failed in the 20s. Well, that's a substance that was used by 70% of the population. So when people say, marijuana is the same thing, Kevin, it's going to follow that same trajectory. Because prohibition of alcohol failed, so therefore prohibition of marijuana. Wait a minute, you're talking about a substance that even though more people use it, 10% of people use on a regular basis in this country. You're comparing that to something that 70% of this country uses, and that, frankly, Western culture has used for 4,000 years in a majority fashion, not in a Chinese culture, 3,000, the pharaohs. No, I'm talking widespread use. There's no contest between the cultural significance. And I hate to just bag on Colorado and Washington the whole time, but other than in Colorado and Washington, maybe Oregon now, we usually don't toast with a marijuana joint in a wedding. They're cultural. We toast with something else, for better or worse. But my point is, you cannot compare the cultural acceptability of those two substances. We're stuck with one of them. It is, I would argue, we pay dearly for it, but we're stuck with it in a sense. And why would we want to basically add to it, I think, is a very important question to ask. I don't want to talk too much about Colorado. I actually am not going to talk really about Colorado because we have people who are the experts here, but just what's amazing is that when you go into it's just incredible. This is what it looks like, basically. I mean, again, a picture's worth 1,000 words. You know what it looks like in the dispensaries. But let me tell you, you ain't seen nothing yet here if you think the dispensaries are a nuisance, depending on what happens with everything that's going on. And so I think the key points in these states are the advertising, the lobby, and the point that was brought up earlier, which should be elaborated on, the recalls of products, the pesticides, right? We were told it would be properly regulated. We'd have people testing it. There have been hundreds of thousands of products recalled last year in Colorado. 60 products, that really is 100, that means hundreds of thousands of individual pieces of product that have been recalled because they're deemed unsafe after the fact. So the promise of regulation, it's really a false promise. If this isn't about regulation, folks. This is about a free-for-all. And let's talk about some other issue here, which is about social justice, which I think is very important. We're told that to right the war on drugs, we should legalize pot. Because then the cops won't be spending all their time arresting people. Now, for the law enforcement in the room, can you please raise your hand in California the last time you remember putting someone in cuffs and putting him behind bars whose only crime was smoking a joint? I'm waiting. Because 80% of Californians think that that's all you do. It's an image problem. But the reality is, folks, that even though that hasn't been the case here for a while, of course there have been disproportionate impacts of a lot of policies, but also a lot of drug policies. We have to admit that when that's a fact in terms of use versus, sort of criminalization, etc. But the idea that legalization will come in and save the day on that one is where I take great issue, because it's not the case at all. Actually, in Colorado, guess who was arrested more last year than before legalization? Young Black and Hispanic kids. Now you might say why? A lot of reasons. I mean, most people think because it's legal for them too. And so they bring it to school and and that's it. And they're using it more outdoors than indoors. And there are a lot of reasons. My point is, regardless even of the reasons, this is not reducing arrests, especially for marginalized populations. It's increasing them. And as we said earlier, where are the pot shops located in Colorado? And also, by the way, here in California under medical. They're located in the poorer communities. There are 8 times as many, by the way, liquor stores in poorer communities of color than in upper class, richer communities. And the investigation by the paper that takes revenue money from the marijuana industry, the Denver Post themselves, said that there was a pot shop for every 47 poor minority residents in some neighborhoods. That can't be ignored. I find it hilarious when the guys that, look like me, who have never fought for civil rights, have never fought for the education issue, do not look at, these disproportionate in any other policy realm, all of a sudden say, yeah, vote to do this because it's going to help our brothers and sisters in Black and Hispanic community. It's going to really help. It's like all of a sudden they become a civil rights, icon to themselves. That's it's a convenient excuse for them to get involved, and this is really what we're seeing across the country. And as we said earlier, and I don't want to dwell on this, Colorado is the #1 state in the country. The legalized and medical states are the top states of use in the country. All of this will be available for you. When you look across the country in terms of less use and more use is in states that have had for a long time more liberal marijuana policies. That's just the reality of it. And we're seeing an increase in those places versus the other places. The tobacco industry, you should know, and I'll leave this for you to research on your own, has been wanting to get into the pot industry since at least the 60s. And they continue to get involved. The 3rd largest tobacco company in the world, folks, Japan Tobacco International, just bought a couple years ago the Silicon Valley startup that has the vaporizer where you can vaporize pot or tobacco. You can do both. This is about concealing use. It's about underage use. Who needs to do that, by the way? You need to do that if you're the 8th grader who used to get caught all the time for smoking pot in the bathroom because you could smell it into the classroom. That's who needs to conceal their use. Or the person who wants to drive and act like it's tobacco or use it in public. Why are we giving that a free pass? It's because the way these laws are written, they're written by the industry and they're written to allow all of these kinds of things, and the tobacco industry knows it. The other issue you should, and I only have 10 minutes and I want to take some questions, so please start writing them, and I just do a few more slides, is this issue safer than alcohol we've debunked. The workplace issue, we could have a whole conference on workplace. What happens when you're a small business owner and your employee slips on the floor and blames you for the fall, but then tests positive for marijuana, but then says, I used marijuana 3 days ago and it's legal. And I have my card. I didn't use it this morning. In fact, I'm going to sue you because this is slippery. Good luck. I mean, the employer workplace issues are massive, and the workplace positives in Colorado and Washington are off the chart compared to the nation. That's not a coincidence. So all kinds of the workplace, we have a lot of this data you should look at with the workplace issue, and we'll leave it all for you. The driving fatalities, don't believe me. If you don't want to believe Hyder, which you should, but if you don't have to. Believe AAA, the people who tow your car at 3 in the morning, that you trust with your life when this guy's coming with the tow truck, you have no idea where he's from, but you've called AAA and you trust that he's been vetted. Okay, that same group of people did a study on drugs driving in Washington State, and they found the massive increases in drug driving since legalization. In fact, the AAA of Southern California, if you're interested, is having a major event in October 5th near the LA, I think near the Art Museum, where they're going to talk about drug driving and the marijuana impact in California. They have said they can stay silent no more on this, as we're legitimizing it day by day. They are seeing the body count mount, and they cannot be silent on it. So I would suggest that if you wanted to go to that, you could. So the conclusions, whether whatever your intent is about marijuana, you think it's just about civil rights or it's about adults using, it doesn't really matter, folks. The industry is in the driver's seat. And there's only one way for them to be stopped. And that's for communities to come together and say, we don't want this. This is not good for education. This is not good for the kid living in the bad part of town who already has been dealt a bad hand in life. You're now saying that marijuana is going to help that person, right? That the employer who has two people in front of them, one coming from a bad part of town, one from a good part of town, who are equal and using marijuana, that's going to help that person get ahead of that? We need communities to come together on this, to really talk about this, to realize that a couple $1 million in tax revenue is not worth mortgaging our community's future on this. I think it's very important. And there's a lot you can do. By the way, there are also a lot of other options, because there's always a question about this, other than legalization or incarceration to deal with marijuana. I mean, you've decriminalized it in California for years, but there are other ways. Why aren't we doing more intervention and brief intervention and treatment? If you're getting caught 10 times a month for outdoor marijuana use and public use and being DUI, rather than just even being given a ticket and sent to go home or being put behind bars, maybe we should see if you actually have a problem. And we should deal with that problem. And I'm not endorsing any of these points of view, but, sorry, here we go. These are actually the points of view. I'm not endorsing these points of view, but there are a lot of other ways to deal with the marijuana issue than just one extreme or the other. So I want to, my last 5 minutes I'd like to use for questions. I want to leave you my personal email on our SAM and then the SAM website, which is learnaboutsam.org. We're obviously very active in California. We have Don Bessie here, who's the SAM Northern California rep, sitting right in front in the red and white tie. If we need more volunteers to be involved. John Redmond and Cadfy really was kind of an incubator for SAM a couple of years ago, and we have other people in the audience, obviously, we've worked with on a regular basis, but we need actually more representation in this neck of the woods, folks. We do. We need people to be able to stand up. We have the data for you. We have the op-eds written that you can gladly copy-paste and say that you came up with. This isn't about credit. And by the way, use these slides everywhere you go, please. And I think everyone would want everyone to use their slides. We don't have time to be arguing for credit. So use them, take credit for them, go out there. We need to educate this state right now before really it gets to a point of no return. And I don't think we're there yet. I think there's a lot of hope. There are a lot of things we can do. Writing op-eds, getting the word out, talking to our elected officials. Not demonizing people for using marijuana, but getting the science out and talking about the social and community impact. So thank you so much for listening to me today. It's such a pleasure to be on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sabet. We do have a few minutes for a few questions. The first one is for Dr. Sabet. I believe there's a huge opportunity to work with the anti-tobacco advocates. Why are we sailing in? Why are we sailing? Where are we going with this? Maybe where are we going with this?
Yeah, well, if you want to just leave these, because usually there's more than the same questions. Yeah, just only a few minutes. I think that the anti-tobacco advocates absolutely should be recruited. We are working with them. By the way, they still have a fight on their hands. I mean, the idea that tobacco is gone is actually a huge myth given what's happening around the country. So we are working with them. We need to work with them more. And if you all have contacts with those folks, in this state especially, that would be very important. There was a question about causal use with marijuana and schizophrenia. I think it's very difficult to impart causation really in anything. But the way these studies are done is, they account for what they call confounding factors. So when they look at someone who has linked marijuana and schizophrenia together, they say, well, what are the other things that could have explained that? Did they use a lot of other drugs? Did they have a history of mental illness? Did they have a genetic predisposition? Were they depressed, anxiety? Are they self-report? They look at all kinds of things and they adjust for those things. I mean, thankfully in stats we can adjust for those things to say, this isn't, let's take that out of the equation, then what happens? And these studies are more and more showing that even when you adjust for all these different things, the connection is still there, significant, it's very, very strong. There's a question about how do we advocate for protecting youth, for example, in meetings that are coming up. This is more specific to Oakland, so I'll let someone else answer that. This is a question that you're not going to catch me answering. I think this was a setup. Who are you voting for in this election? I'm not answering that one. There was a question about polling, given the polling about the passage. Folks, I would say be skeptical of polling and follow the money to see who pays for the poll, first of all, before you listen to it. Secondly, see how the question was written. Is it, should you pass whatever because then, or do you agree with adults using marijuana, should we then legalize it? Or is it asked in a different way? Do you think we should have marijuana legalized with advertising? Because that's what will happen, by the way. Do you think we should have marijuana with edibles? And you'll have dramatically different answers. Don't believe the hype of the polls. Inevitability is the #1 thing that the lobby is pushing. They want you to feel helpless. They want you to feel like, despite your best efforts, there's nothing you can do. Imagine if we felt like that 20 years ago with tobacco. Can you imagine that you can't smoke in a restaurant now? 30, 40 years ago, you would have been called crazy. Can you imagine that most kids think smoking's uncool. 87% of kids think smoking cigarettes is uncool. By the way, 50% of them think marijuana's no problem. That's what doesn't make any sense, obviously, from a scientific point of view. But this is imagine where we have gone with that. I think we can do that with marijuana, and I think the last one was about something about concerns for farmers. I think that'll be talked later in the day. And then there's so that was the last one. I think it is a huge issue with farmers. Actually, the farmers are not happy about this. This changes the rural landscape. Look at folks in Oregon and how the rural landscape has been changed from these massive, ugly, actually we have to be honest about it, ugly, massive marijuana grows that change the landscape of a rural community. Why you can go to a rural community in the first place is not to have a big white warehouse box in the center of the valley. And so these are the questions and issues that should be brought up to people now, so that you're not going to a conference in a year saying what the folks in Colorado and Washington and Oregon and Alaska are saying, which is, well, we didn't know about that, or we tried, but people didn't understand it. We have the time and opportunity now to educate folks on this issue. I think it's very important to do so. Good luck in your endeavors. We stand ready.